For those of you who don't know me, my name is Don, and I'm a consultant in life sciences. And this morning, I'm very excited to get into an interview with Dr. David Burkus. But before we do that, I just wanted to also quickly mention that as a part of my consulting practice, we cut across the pharmaceutical, medical device, and biotech industries, helping companies increase their capacity by providing the needed clarity in strategy, people, process, and technology. So with that, let me just talk about my guest here for a second. So in this episode of Life Science Success, I'm interviewing one of the world's leading business thinkers, Dr. David Burkus. Forward-thinking ideas and best-selling books are helping leaders be their best team ever. And so thank you for being on, David.
Oh, thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, thanks a lot. And so I've studied a little bit of your journey and have stalked you for a while. I mean, we talked earlier in the year before you were ready to release your most recent book, and I had said, hey, I'd love to have you on. I think you're covering a lot of really great things that life science companies can benefit from, and so. Would you mind just sharing a little bit of your story and sort of what led you here? What made you want to become somebody that essentially coaches teams and works with organizations?
Yeah, well, so all right, what's funny is a part of my bio that almost never gets read because it's irrelevant in almost every other context is that I got my start in life sciences. So my first job out of college was carrying the bag for a pharmaceutical company. So I started on the sales side, got into a little bit of training and management, et cetera, but then decided to go back to graduate school and went to grad school for organizational psychology. Originally a master's. Actually, the master's was part-time while I was still in pharma, and then a couple things changed. The Affordable Care Act passed with all sorts of changes in how sales and marketing was regulated. And I thought, well, maybe I should go full time, right? Grad school. Maybe academics might be a little bit more stable. I don't know what's going to happen over the next couple of years in this industry, right? And so went into that, became a business school professor for about 10 years. Started writing more towards practitioners. I probably made a lot of enemies in the academic world because I was just sort of like, what's the point of doing all this research and putting it in a journal that gets read by 15 people instead of getting it out there into the world where it can be useful by people? So I was joked I was trying to get good ideas out of the ivory tower and into the corner office. Of course, now it's corner office, co-working space, car, right? Wherever people are doing work.
Right.
And so that's been, that was a transition that accelerated during COVID. And since probably 2020, that's been the majority of my work is either working through keynotes or workshops directly with organizations, whether it's sometimes senior leadership teams, sometimes running an event for, everyone in kind of middle management. But I think the core message in all of it is that we really ought to focus on the culture of the team. We really ought to focus on, maybe before COVID, but truthfully, depending on the organization, it may have never been true. We used to think of engagement and capacity and all of those sort of things as built at a company-wide level. And there's some things you can do at a company-wide level, but really it comes down to every person who's in charge of a team taking responsibility for the culture of their team. That's going to affect performance a whole lot more. And so that's been the message that I've been like banging the drum on forever. And I think the one that got you and I connected as well. Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting to me. So, I've been a follower of Dory Clark for a while, and along with that, then I believe that she did a podcast with you a while back as well, and then after that, I started actually seeing more of those YouTube shorts that you do. So you have a series of leadership YouTube shorts that I've enjoyed quite a bit. I mean, because I feel like you hit great topics in 60 seconds or less. And so oftentimes, in between calls, I've got 60 seconds as well. And so, occasionally I'll pop, one or two of those up as well.
Oh, thank you. No, that's been a really fun experiment. I started playing around with YouTube in 2018, but I was doing it totally wrong, totally wrong. Because in 2018, we were doing short form content filmed this way, like filmed landscape mode. And it was like 2 or 3 minutes at a time where YouTube wanted 8 to 10 minute videos. Then we pivoted to 8 to 10 minute videos, and like 6 months later, they came up with shorts, which is essentially their ripoff of TikTok and Instagram and what have you. But we finally caught up to what they were doing, and the response actually has been kind of awesome. I really think, I think about this from sort of a training and development standpoint a lot of times. I really think depending on the job that you're in, there's a big place for that kind of micro content, right? You have 10 minutes in between meetings, you're waiting in line. I mean, I remember, again, this takes me back 20 something years ago. You're carrying the bag for a pharma company and you're sitting in a doctor's office waiting to go back and actually talk to them. I don't have time to do a 30-minute training on my computer, but I can flip through some of that and kind of develop myself. And it's certainly a lot more productive than, checking sports scores or watching some of the other stuff that's on YouTube Shorts that isn't all that helpful to one's career. So that's what we've been trying to do, kind of bring the light to that area, because there's a reason that format is so engaging. I'm just trying to put content there that's actually truly making the workplace better for people. Yeah.
Yeah. And then let's talk for a minute about your books, right? So you have 4 books, is that correct?
5, depending on how you count, but yeah,
Okay.
yeah. We did a project with Audible just before the pandemic that was a pure audio only play. But yeah.
All right. So I have Friend of a Friend. What is that book about?
So that's a book on networks and networking, right? So there's a couple different ideas in that book. The biggest one is that most people take other people's advice on networking and making connections, and as a result, they usually feel sleazy and inauthentic, right? Like people will tell you, oh yeah, I just, in the conversation, I say people's names 3 times and that helps me remember. And then you go try that and you're like, this is really weird and awkward. Well, no wonder, because you're not me and you can't take my advice. You'd be pretending to be someone. So maybe we should zoom out and look about what's universally true of networks and how networks are formed and connect and what have you. And so in that, we outline kind of 10 principles from the world of network science. The biggest one is that sort of friend of a friend principle. The phenomenon of 6 degrees of separation or 6 degrees of Kevin Bacon, depending on where you learned it, really actually is a true verified thing. The whole world is connected by about 5 or 6 introductions. Now, I'm not actually interested in that. What I am interested in is just the math. If you think about your own career, right? If the whole world is connected by 6 introductions, odds are everyone you need is 1 or 2 introductions away, everyone you need for your career. So it's really, less about how to work a room and more about exploring the fringes of your network, finding those friend of a friend people that can really actually transform your life.
That's amazing. And there's so much there that I could dive into as well. And I feel like, so one of the platforms obviously that we're, live streaming this to is LinkedIn. And I feel like, one of the things that they constantly are doing is like, here's somebody else that, is adjacent to where you are. I feel like they're trying to do that, but then also they limit you to 30,000 connections. And so whenever, you're you or Dory Clark is Dory Clark, right. You have limitations placed on you where your 6 degrees, all of a sudden becomes this massive universe of people. Right. And, it's tremendous, from that aspect, but also how many of those people are you close to, I think is the real kind of purpose, in that is, make sure that you're really focusing as an individual instead of having the world that you're joined to.
Well, and the other thing I would say is that we in the book we talk about what I jokingly call LinkedIn stalking, right? Which is where you'll try and, hey, I want to get connected to Procter and Gamble, and so you'll type that into LinkedIn and you'll see, oh, Don Davis is 1 degree separation away from these 2 people. Let me go beg Don for an introduction. Like, well, you might not actually know those people. I'm connected to lots of people I don't actually know who just like my work, right? Which is 2 faults actually. The first is that there might not be a connection significant enough to do a recommendation. The other is I might not know you. Like, people forget that every introduction is also a recommendation. Mm-hmm. Every introduction is, whether you say it is or not, I'm vouching for you. I'm putting some of my social capital, my credibility on the line by introducing you. And I might not know enough about you to feel comfortable introducing you. So a better posture, and this is how we find things like 6 degrees of separation, is to take an open posture. So instead of saying, let me search that in and find a couple connections and then go beg them, just ask lots of different people in your network, hey, who do you know who works for Procter and Gamble, right? Just ask lots of different people there. You're going to get answers you didn't expect, which is awesome. And almost every name you get is going to be somebody that they would feel comfortable introducing you to. Otherwise, they wouldn't have said it, right? If I don't feel comfortable introducing you to somebody there, I'm just not going to list their name when you ask me. So you end up getting a lot more names and names that you're much more likely to make a connection with. So it's a much better posture to take.
Yeah. Okay. And then under new management, what is that book about?
So this is sort of a future of work book. So this one came before Friend of a Friend. And it's funny because it led to a lot of my later work. And the idea there was just to look at the way the workplace is shifting. There were kind of two different big macro trends happening at the same time in 2016. One was we entered sort of the 4 generational workplace. So we had millennials, we had Gen X, we had baby boomers, and even the last of sort of the silent or greatest generation, et cetera. Now we're still in that 4, but it's sort of shifted, and now it's Gen Z, millennial, Gen X. And that changed a bunch of things. The other thing is the nature of work was changing. More and more people were shifting, not just from industrial work to what Peter Drucker would call knowledge work, but to truly sort of creative work. Most people, especially most people listening to this, your real job is to solve problems.
Right.
You might not know what those problems are right now, but your real job is to solve problems. That requires tapping into creative thinking and critical thinking skills. And that requires a little bit different way to manage people, right? You can't think about presence equaling productivity. I see you, therefore you're a hard worker or a valuable worker, right? And so we explored a lot of different trends in that book. Probably what turned out to be the biggest trend, a bit of foreshadowing here, was that we looked at companies that gave employees a ton of autonomy, and some that didn't even have offices, right? Isn't this crazy? A 1,200 person organization that doesn't have a home office, everybody works remotely. Now, little did I know that by the end of 2020, that would be the most in-demand thing. And what ended up happening is we pulled from that book, circled back and did a lot of new interviews, a lot of new research that had happened over 4 years. And that became the book Leading from Anywhere, which was all about how to manage when you didn't ask for a remote team, right? You didn't sign. What's funny is a lot of remote companies use the book, but the target audience of that is 2 months ago, I had a team that was fully in person. Now I have a team that's fully remote.
Yeah.
Help. Right. And that was really the idea of the book. And we use that term from anywhere because I made the big bet that turned out to be true that like we're not going back to the office 9 to 5, 5 days a week. We're headed towards this hybrid, or I was calling it from anywhere world, and we ought to get ready. The skills that we're going to develop managing remotely, we're going to use for the rest of our careers because we're not going back to only ever collaborating with people in person.
Yeah, and I mean, it's interesting, right? I mean, there are lots of ways that companies could spy on people. There's ways that you could have people track time. There's lots of ways that you could sort of like overreach, this, and sort of deplete what you want out in terms of output for your team. I feel like, and then there's another side of this where you could say, look, I'm going to focus on the output of my people and empower them and build a runway to go do everything that they would normally do if we were in the office. And I feel like there's a mix that I've seen, right? There's an interplay that I continue to see, overall. And I also see a lot of leaders, just being afraid of, quiet quitting, and, the fact that hybrid work just removes them one more step from their people.
Yeah, I lost count early in the pandemic of the number of times I got asked questions about, like what spying software works well. How do I know? Should I run? There were so many managers that are like, oh yeah, I run a check-in every morning at 8:30. We all sign into Zoom. That way I know they've started their day. Like, who cares? Right? If you need spying software to know that your people are doing a good job, you screwed up long before the pandemic forced you into a remote environment. Right? So go back to there. How do you know they're working? Well, you know that by the quality of their work. Right? It might take you a little, if you have a troubled employee, this is the one place where I'll make an exception. It might take you a little longer in this new environment to document their problems, put them on a performance improvement plan, et cetera. It's certainly easier to be like, you were late, right? I get that, right? But most people are not that. Most of your employees, I assume you did a decent job in hiring them. And so most of them are competent enough to where you can give them a little more autonomy than you may have thought you can.
Yeah. And I feel like it's an opportunity, right? I mean, it's an opportunity for leaders to look at the environment that you want to create for people to want to work with you as well. And so the last book that I have on my list, and then we'll get into the the new book. So it's the myths of creativity.
Yep. Yep. So
Yeah.
that was my first book. That's the baby book, right? That was 10 years ago this year, actually. And it was exactly what it sounds. It's a book on what we get wrong about creativity and problem solving, the stories that we tell ourselves about how it's supposed to work. Like there are so many in organizations, there are so many groups I run into who will talk at length about conflict resolution, as in conflict is a problem that needs to be solved, and never about how conflict is actually a sign that you've got people with diverse views and divergent thinking is at play. And if you do it well and keep it task focused, you'll end up with better solutions than if you just try and resolve that conflict, right? So the book kind of explores 10 different myths or misconceptions around creativity and what the actual research says on how it's supposed to work in teams.
Very good. And then the recent book is The Best Team Ever, and it was my read of the book, maybe slightly different than the approach most people might take. But whenever I looked at it, I was like, okay, so he starts with curling, and then he goes into another. He uses another sports analogy next, and then I mean, I felt like the use of curling at the very beginning. I was like, okay.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, let's see. So, okay, we go curling and then we go fast food, right? I think is the second story in the book. And then we go
Okay.
back to sports. But yeah, no,
Yeah, yeah.
that's not a bad point. That's probably those. I probably did a bad job front loading with sports analogies because it's really not about sports teams, right?
Right. Yeah, yeah.
But the curling story is just too good. For those of you that are listening or watching and you're like, what the heck are they talking about? Essentially in the Winter Olympics in USA, until this one group of people had a terrible track record in curling. So much so that they decided to invest a ton of money and create this sort of high performance program. And all of their previous players who had tried and failed to have medal or have any success in curling were not invited to the program. But that didn't sit well with those exact players. And so they started training themselves. They adopted this moniker of like Team Reject. We've been rejected from USA Curling. And yet, when they started to do that and they started to train each other, they ended up winning more. And they eventually ended up beating all of the hand-picked teams that USA Curling put together. They ended up going to the Olympics. And of course, now everybody is bracing for failure because they're the same people that failed last time. How could we possibly bring them back, right? And yet they won. They won the Team USA's first gold medal in curling. More importantly, the first gold medal that didn't go to Sweden or Canada. So there's a win there too. Um, and the reason we tell the story is not just that it's kind of cool, right? That this whole group under Team Reject and what have you. It's that USA Curling's problem is kind of every leader's problem, which is how do I identify the right talent? How do I put them on a team? And why is it that the more I try and get really specific about who we're bringing into the team, the talent that we're bringing into the team, the less often we end up with a great team? Well, it's because talent doesn't make the team and the team's culture makes the talent. The thing that happened with Team Reject that I would argue made them so successful is now they had responsibility for themselves and they had to function as just that group of four. It wasn't about being the best in a larger program. It was about how we four are going to train each other and collaborate. And they improved their team culture such that they were the most refined team that showed up at the Olympic Games. Or sorry, in curling, they call it a Bonspiel for reasons that I still can't figure out.
Yeah. Well, it's I mean, for those who haven't curled as well, it's a very lengthy sort of sport. I was kind of surprised at how long, it goes as well. I mean, it's probably almost, and this is just an over exaggeration on my part, almost as long as a cricket match in India, but it feels like a very long time to be on the ice sweeping. So yeah.
Yeah. And it requires, when I was doing the research on this, it requires far more flexibility than you would think. There are not a lot of John Schuster was like 38, 40 years old when he won the Olympic. There are not a lot of 40-year-olds that can squat and contort themselves into the position you need to actually slide that stone. So anybody that watches it and thinks it's not a real sport, like, No, it's actually, it's not just sweeping. It's actually pretty
Yeah,
difficult.
right. Yeah, yeah, I completely agree with that. A lot of the people that are listening, right? We probably have some people that are in newer organizations where they're just forming, kind of their first team beyond friends, right? So the way I see a lot of organizations come together is, let's say the founder has an idea or pulls out intellectual property out of a university or some other place that they've sort of associated themselves with. Beyond that, normally it goes to the friends, right? So there's
Yep.
there's normally some sort of close association with that first 5 or 10 people inside of the organization, and then beyond that, it's this is where we start to get into the unknown.
Yeah.
And then you have the other side of things as well, where we have people inside of larger organizations that certainly watch and listen to these. And so I wanted to just talk a little bit about, is there a point either in a newer organization or even an established organization where you feel like teams are really formed best, and just to touch on that a little bit.
Yeah, I would say there's a point in the growth cycle of every organization where a focus on teams suddenly becomes the most important thing, right? And obviously I'm biased in that because I'm an organizational psychologist who studies team culture. But you what you described, that sort of founding team that's friends and family, et cetera, there's usually already some collegiality there, et cetera. When the organization grows to the point where not everyone reports to the founder or founders, right? And B, the senior leadership team involves people who are not friends and family. They are, oh, we need a chief financial officer. Let's hire a headhunter and let's find one, right? Those are the two moments where you really have to start paying attention to team culture. The first is because usually you can't, things like mission, vision, purpose, things like how we're going to work. When you're when you're 5 people or 10 people who all report to the founder, you can kind of have a benevolent dictatorship there, right? But as soon as you get to the point where there are multiple teams and not everyone responds to the founder, that's where every leader at every level needs to take responsibility for their team and the culture of that team, because it doesn't just rub off from the founder anymore. It's not just directly influenced by that. It's too big to do that. And then the second reason is that, I mean, the single biggest thing, especially in an early stage growth company, but also in large organizations I work with, the single biggest thing that's going to determine the success or failure of an organization is how well their senior leadership team functions like an actual team and not just a group of representatives from a variety of different little fiefdoms, right? I'm chief financial officer, but actually I'm just the representative from the finance department or the research department or whatever, right? I work with a lot of senior leadership teams that don't feel like teams. They feel like 17 people who get in a room once a quarter and argue with each other. And that's not what we're going for. That's going to be a limiting factor in the growth of the organization. So I think for those two reasons, once you get to the point, and I can't give you a head count because it depends on the organizational structure. But once you get to the point where we've grown beyond the ability for the founder to have everyone in his or her sphere of influence or in their sphere of influence, that's when we have to stop thinking company-wide and start thinking team-specific.
Yeah. Yeah, it's funny because I do something similar with scaling organizations, right? There's a lot of discussion that we have about, if it starts to feel like there are mud on the tires that you just can't get off anymore, if it feels like you're less efficient than you were before, most likely those are points, where I get started as well with scaling organizations. Sounds to me like you use a similar analogy where, look, as you start to see these things arise that demonstrate that you need to be building a team culture. Those are the moments that are kind of indicating that it's time for your work to start as well.
Yeah, exactly. Well said.
And then you do spend a little bit of time, as well, talking about creating a sense of purpose, on a team. Can we just touch on, some of the tips or ideas that you would have for leaders in terms of an approach for creating a sense of purpose for a team?
Yeah. So, and specifically in the book, we use the term pro-social purpose, which draws from a lot of Adam Grant and others' work on pro-social motivation. In essence, I think I'm grateful that about 10 or 15 years ago, a lot of people, one really influential gentleman in particular, forced this conversation about people wanting to know why they do what they do. But respectfully, I think why is the wrong question. I think who is the question that actually motivates, as in who is served by the work that we're doing. When you look at the actual research on how humans are motivated, protecting and promoting the well-being of others is one of our primary intrinsic drivers, right? And we know this, right? Like, this is why people get into life sciences, right? Because they want to help, they want to make a difference, they want to make people's lives better. The challenge is, again, when you're in that growth mode, and you're especially if you're removed from the end beneficiary, if you're just doing research in a lab somewhere and or you're just running in the home office, you're not interacting with patients or doctors or what have you, it becomes really hard to see the direct beneficiaries of your work. And so smart and savvy organizations will put systems in place to tell those stories on a regular basis. Whether it's, one of the examples we talk about in the book is Medtronic, that for a long time would have their holiday parties where they would invite people with devices implanted in them, right, pacemakers and what have you, to come in and actually talk about their life post-operation, post-device, et cetera. So people who didn't normally get to see that got to interact with those direct beneficiaries of their work. And that does two things. Not only does it enhance sort of personal intrinsic motivation, but when you look at the research, we also see an increase in what nerds like me call organizational citizenship behaviors, which is a fancy way of saying the times people put we over me, the times people put the organization and the importance of those goals over my own personal career goals, et cetera. In other words, the times where people focus in on teamwork.
Very good. You also have a pod. Now I'm the one that has the morning voice. You also have a podcast called David Burkus Presents. One of the recent episodes, you covered how to make your employees feel respected. Have you seen a shift in employees feeling respected with hybrid work?
Yeah. I feel like every week I have a conversation with a different organization that says, hey, we've finalized our hybrid strategy. We want people in the office 2 days a week, or we're going to stay remote, whatever it is. But our people still report really high levels of disengagement and feeling disconnected, and no surprise, right? Humans are social creatures. Now, that doesn't mean everybody has to go back to the office. Obviously, I have a whole book on why that doesn't need to happen. It does mean that leaders are going to have to be a little more deliberate. And in that episode and in that article, one of the core ones we talk about is this idea of giving fair feedback. In other words, giving feedback in proportion to how someone's doing. A lot of times when we do our one-on-ones, if somebody's work is 90% good and 10% needs development, we still spend half or more of the conversation on that 10%. And that's, even if you were 100% in person with people, that's a bad strategy, right? It ought to be fair, meaning in proportion. If it's 90% good, then let's spend 90% time talking about what they're doing well and how we can build upon it, right? You don't have to say you're doing great, no need to develop, but if you're developing in an area that you already feel strong in, you still are more motivated to do it, right? But the other thing that happens is, at least that I've noticed, and this is anecdotal, I would love to do a study on this, I just haven't gotten around to it yet, is that when you're in a remote or hybrid environment and you don't see your boss every day, one of the things you're deprived from is sort of the micro praises, right? The little like, hey, great job on that. Or I see you in the hall and I'm like, hey, thanks so much for that report. It was awesome. It was exactly what I needed. You bank those, right? As an individual, you are thinking about how often you've gotten that. And so if you're not getting any of those because no one's being deliberate about it, because they weren't deliberate before, they were just seeing you serendipitously, and then you do your deliberate one-on-one and it's in disproportion to how you're doing, you can have a lot of people who end up feeling they're doing a terrible job and their contribution isn't actually respected, when it is. When you actually do legitimately love the work that you're doing, it's just because where you used to rely on accidental praise, right, or serendipitous praise, you're not being deliberate about it anymore, so that when it comes time to give people the constructive feedback, they're less receptive to it because they feel attacked. They feel like you're not actually getting an accurate picture, right? And this is, by the way, every person that's listening to this can probably think of a one-on-one they've had in the last year, or an annual performance review they've had in the last year where they're like, yeah, exactly. So, the big thing there is not only giving fair feedback, but making sure you're deliberate about those little micro praises. Set reminders in your phone if you have to, because people really do bank those, and those stretch a long way. And when it comes time to give people that constructive feedback, it's way better received when they know that, okay, Don actually values my work. Just yesterday, he was telling me great job on this. So I really do need to take this feedback to heart.
Yeah, and you just kind of, spurred a thought as well in me that there's a level of just, I feel like leadership education that needs to happen, as well, in terms of, specifically that topic, right? How do you continually find the positive, that's going on in your organization with your people, specifically to find those opportunities as well, and genuinely, um, acknowledge them versus, sort of, people also would very well know if you're, not genuine with it either. And that would probably have a very negative effect as well.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I agree. It starts with just making that collection, right? That'd be my biggest piece of advice in terms of training is just figure out what system works well for you to collect those moments and then make sure you're ready to share them at any given point.
Very good. And then I've added a question recently to podcast episodes just because I really appreciate all the time that I get with each one of the leaders who are on my podcast. And one of the things that I really would love to know from you is, what is some of the greatest leadership advice that you've ever received?
Oh, wow. Okay. Well, the one that popped into my head right off the bat, so maybe that's the greatest, or maybe it's just the most salient, is from Alan Mulally. We talk about Alan in the book, Your Best Team Ever. Alan's turnaround of Ford Motor Company and getting a senior leadership team to actually work like a team is tremendous. Everybody should buy Best Team Ever just for that. Or if you're not sold on Best Team Ever, there's a whole book called American Icon, which is a journalist, like a 250-page telling of the whole turnaround of Ford. It's a phenomenal leadership case study. Anyway, one of the things Alan says all of the time when he's thinking about his interactions with people and interactions with teams, et cetera, is this: it's nice to be important, but it's important to be nice. Right. And one of the things, he knew coming into Ford, you had this Detroit toxic competitive culture going on where everybody was looking to be the most important person in the room, to shove other people down so they could climb up and get a promotion, et cetera. And that was one of the things he had to change almost immediately, because you can't confront the brutal facts. You can't actually talk about, here's the situation we're in and how are we going to get out of it, if everybody's just posturing for position. And that came to a head. I mean, there were people that he had to essentially fire. Alan is this nice, like, Kansas farm boy in demeanor and personality, right? So he would never say fire. But there were several instances where he would talk about, somebody would make a joke at someone else's expense consistently, right? Or put another member of the team down consistently. And he'd pull them aside and he'd go, hey, we don't do that on this team. We need to get people to feel psychologically safe. We need to get people to feel like they can actually express where they're struggling so we can help them. And you acting like that doesn't help me. So you need to make a choice on whether or not you want to make a change. And then this is the funny part about Alan. Alan will always say, and whatever you decide, it's okay. Which is a confusing statement at first, because you're like, wait, it's okay if I decide not to make a change? No. If you don't make the change, then you're no longer the chief marketing officer at Ford. But that's okay. I still love you, right? I'll support your decision. I'll help you find a new job, et cetera. But if you're going to stay and you're going to be a member of this team, you need to do that. So it's nice to be important, but it's far more important to be nice to the people on your team, because you're going to need them to admit where they're failing. If they don't trust you to do that, you're not going to get the truth from them, and you're not going to end up solving the right problems, and you're not going to end up turning the organization around anyway.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, so many of us, have an organization bigger than one. So, it's if your organization's bigger than one, you're counting on people, you're counting on teams. It's a reflection of the fact that you just need, to be nice so that people will, more or less want to help you at the end of the day.
Yeah.
So there are 3 questions that I like to ask every guest. What inspires you?
Inspires me is an interesting question. The reason I go to work, I wouldn't say the reason I wake up. The reason I wake up is usually because an 11-year-old and a 9-year-old has climbed into my room and demanded breakfast. But the reason I go to work every day is I'm inspired to make work not suck. That's a line I sort of poached from the world of organizational psychology. I know Adam Grant and a few others of us say it all the time, but that's truthfully what we study in org behaviors. How to make work is so central to our lives that it's too important to be terrible, right? And even though it changed and it shifted during the pandemic, it's still a central tenet of what most people do. And we can talk about work-life balance all we want, but if your work life is toxic, then you're going to carry that into your other spheres of life as well. And so my goal is really to make most people's experience of work one that actually taps into their potential, but mostly just one that doesn't suck, one that isn't toxic. I keep a somewhere in here on these crazy bookshelves behind me, I have a red stapler. If you remember, if you're old enough to remember the movie Office Space, you know the importance of the red stapler. And I keep it there because my reminder is like, I dream of a world where no one finds that movie funny because no one can relate to how terrible that work experience is. Right now, it's a naive goal. We're probably never going to hit it, but hey, it keeps me working every day.
And, maybe as your children get old enough to really appreciate the movie, your swing line stapler gets swiped.
Gets stolen? Yeah, well, if it does, I'm going to burn the whole place down.
Very good. What concerns you?
I think right now the biggest thing that I'm focused in on related to work is I think a lot of organizations are doing this hybrid or from anywhere wrong. I think they're just picking a number of days that people need to be back at the office and not recognizing that the office is a tool for collaboration just like any other tool. And what we need to have is a broader conversation about the type of work that should happen at the office and the type of work that should happen remotely or privately. And then once we know that, we can get a way better sense of how often people should actually be together. But I honestly get the impression that a lot of organizations are just picking a number out of a hat, 2, 3, whatever. This is how often you're back. And then everybody comes back and they join their Zoom calls anyway. And if we go down that route, right? If the majority of organizations go down that route, then by 2025, 2026, we'll be right back to where we were before the pandemic, where people don't have the freedom and autonomy that they've gotten from their work over the last couple of years. And that's a huge problem because not every organization is doing that. I work with a ton of amazing organizations that are doing it right. And those organizations are going to become talent magnets when we get to 2025 or 2026. It's the ones that are just picking a number out of a hat or just calling everybody back without thinking about the type of work we want to do. They're going to bleed talented people in the next couple of years. And that concerns me a lot.
And there is a strong belief as well that I get from people who study infectious diseases that there will be another one of those, right? There will be another COVID at some point in our future, and it could potentially even be worse. Not for that purpose, but really just in terms of thinking ahead and being proactive and making sure that your organization is one that's taking the right steps to try and really motivate people in the right way and get them oriented the right way. It seems to me like it's a smart decision to make. How do I best enable teams? How do I make them the most collaborative they can be, etc.
Yeah, no, I agree.
Yeah.
And it may not even be pandemic related, right? Like we're recording this in the midst of like this incredible tragedy going on in Maui, right? Which necessitates if you've got employees who are there, like you've got a way more important thing to focus on right now, but those people are going to be displaced for a long period of time. And so calling them back into it's not going to work. You're going to be a much more resilient organization if your people know how to work well as a team from anywhere, even if they're in the office the majority of the time, right? And then that's the other thing, as we grow and the world shrinks and globalization becomes an undeniable reality, which it already has been for like 10 years, the amount of collaboration we're going to have cross-culturally and around the whole world, because now we all know how to collaborate virtually, that's going to increase. So these aren't skills that like we just get to go back to the office and go back to the way it was in 2019. There's no going back, right? There's just what are we going forward to?
Right. Last question. What excites you?
Oh, man. Well, I'm excited by the organizations that I work with that are doing it right. I'm excited by the reactions we're getting to the book, that I think people really are thinking about this at a team-wide level. But really, if I'm being totally honest with you, this is not work related at all. What excites me is that we're like 2 weeks away from the start of college football.
Well, that's a good thing to look forward to on the personal side as well. Yeah,
exactly. As soon as the temperatures start dropping again and the days start getting shorter, I start counting down the days to that. I know.
Oh, really nice. So why don't you tell the people a little bit about where they can find your book, how they might be able to get a copy?
Yeah, I mean, the easiest thing to do, I'm really blessed. Unlike Don Davis, David Burkus is a very rare name. And
Right.
so if you type it into Google, you will find me, right? That'll take you to davidburkus.com, our website, where you can find out more about all of this sort of stuff. You could type it in Amazon and you'll find all of the books, et cetera. But that's probably the easiest place to go. And then again, type it into YouTube or LinkedIn or wherever, and you'll find those short videos that Don and I were talking about earlier. I think you're gonna. No, I know you're gonna love them because so many people already do, which is really awesome to see. I'm blown away by the response that we're getting on a lot of them, and so we'll keep doing them.
Yeah, and I would also recommend, people really take the time to go visit your website. Primarily because not only do you have, a lot of these things, available for people that are looking for them, you also have a course there, I noticed as well.
Yeah, yeah. So build your best team ever. It sort of grew right out of the book itself, but it's actually a combination of the videos we were talking about and the book itself, right? So a book is great, but not everyone's going to sit down and read a 40,000 word book or listen to me read it to them or what have you. So the idea with Build Your Best Team Ever is it's just the actions. So it's not the stories. You won't learn anything about curling. But it's just the research and then the actions. There's 34 modules. Each is less than 3 minutes long. And each module is here's an activity you could do with your team. If you're struggling with this, try this activity. If you're struggling with this, try this one. And so I can't promise you all 34 are going to be amazing, but I can promise you that in 34, you're going to find one that is worth the money.
Very good. Well, Dr. David Burkus, thank you so much for being on the Life Science Success Podcast. I greatly appreciated our time together. And yeah, I look forward to more people talking about the best team ever and you know, hopefully go out and get a copy of the book.
Yeah, no, thank you so much for having me.
Thanks a lot.